the groom's wealthy family dead in the eye and introduced me by saying, "This is our other daughter. She just cleans houses for a living." I didn't flinch. My dad even chuckled, adding, "Yeah, we've pretty much given up on her." They expected me to look down in shame, playing the role of the family embarrassment they'd assigned to me for years. But the laughter died instantly when the groom's billionaire mother froze solid, her glass crashing to the floor. She looked at me, her face completely draining of color, and whispered, "Wait, you're the Ms. Vance?" The entire head table locked up. My parents smiled nervously, completely oblivious to the fact that their petty attempt to humiliate me had just exposed a multi-million-dollar secret. You're watching from, so I can see how far my voice has reached. My name is Maya Vance, and at 28 years old, I've long held the official title of the family black sheep. While my parents spent every waking moment obsessing over social status and pouring their life savings into my golden child sister, Chloe, I was always treated like a complete outsider. To them, Chloe's corporate job was a badge of honor, whereas my decision to start my own local cleaning service was an embarrassment they tried desperately to hide from their wealthy country club friends. The boiling point came on the night of Chloe's high-profile engagement dinner. I arrived at the incredibly lavish, crystal chandelier venue expecting to celebrate, but instead, my mother met me at the door with a cold, disgusted sneer. Before I could even greet the guests, she practically shoved a basic, plain black dress into my hands, whispering that I needed to change immediately so I would blend in with a hired help, rather than ruin Chloe's big night. I took the dress and quietly changed, refusing to give them the satisfaction of tears. As I walked back out and took my seat at the far edge of the head table, I could see my parents whispering maliciously to each other, their eyes darting over to me with smug satisfaction. I knew exactly what they were doing. They had intentionally set a trap to completely marginalize and humiliate me in front of Chloe's new, aristocratic in-laws. But little did they know, I was walking into that trap completely armed. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal wine glass cut through the chatter, and my mother stood up to deliver her toast. I watched her adjust her pearls, a predatory smile stretching across her face as she looked around the room, making sure she had the undivided attention of the groom's wealthy family. She spoke eloquently about Chloe for a few minutes, painting her as the ultimate trophy daughter, but I knew the real performance hadn't even started yet. Suddenly, her eyes locked onto me at the edge of the table, her expression shifting into a mask of synthetic pity. "We are just so blessed," my mother announced loudly, her voice echoing off the venue walls as she gestured directly toward me. "Of course, we must also introduce our other daughter, Maya. She just cleans houses for a living." The words hung heavily in the air, a calculated strike meant to completely lower my standing before the city's elite. Right on cue, my dad let out a soft chuckle from his seat, adding, "Yeah, we've pretty much given up on her." They genuinely expected me to duck my head in shame, to shrink under the weight of the collective gasps at the table. I could see the smug, triumphant satisfaction radiating from Chloe's face as she leaned back, confident that my presence had successfully highlighted her own perfection. But I just sat there, holding my wine glass with a perfectly calm, unbothered smile. They thought they were stripping away my dignity, completely oblivious to the explosive truth I was holding back. The smug laughter at the table died instantly, cut short by the sharp, echoing shatter of a crystal glass hitting the marble floor. All eyes snapped toward the head of the table, where the groom's mother, Victoria Sterling, sat frozen solid. Victoria wasn't just wealthy. She was a notoriously ruthless billionaire real estate mogul who controlled the vast majority of the city's commercial high-rises and luxury properties. She didn't look at my parents, and she didn't look at the mess on the floor. Instead, her sharp, piercing eyes were locked dead onto mine, her face completely draining of color as a look of absolute shock took over her features. "Wait," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned forward, completely ignoring the wine dripping from the table. You're the Ms. Vance?" The entire head table locked up, the sudden shift in tension thick enough to cut with a knife. My mother's predatory smile faltered, replaced by a look of sheer confusion as she looked between the two of us, completely oblivious to what is happening. Victoria wasn't recognizing a simple maid. She had just realized she was looking at the reclusive founder and CEO of Vance Elite Holdings. My premium asset management and corporate maintenance empire didn't just clean houses. We controlled the ultimate operational contracts for every major commercial portfolio in the region. Victoria had spent the last 3 months desperately trying to secure a meeting with my executive team to save her own failing commercial empire from a massive logistical crisis. And now, she had just realized her son's future in-laws were publicly insulting her ultimate savior. My mother let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, completely misreading the absolute dread filling the room. "Oh, Victoria, dear, please don't let Maya confuse you," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness as she waved a hand dismissively in my direction. "She's just a simple maid. We only invited her tonight because she's family, but she really doesn't understand how high society works." "Shut up," Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. The sheer venom in her tone made my mother gasp, her hand instantly flying to her pearls as my father choked on his drink. Victoria slammed both hands onto the mahogany table, leaning forward as she demanded to know why the woman who single-handedly owned the most powerful estate services firm in the state was being spoken to like garbage by her own parents. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Victoria hissed, her eyes darting between my parents and my sister, Chloe, who was now trembling in her seat. "This woman commands an empire. Her company holds the keys to my entire real estate portfolio, and you are treating her like an unwanted beggar." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the smug satisfaction completely vanish from my parents' faces as the brutal reality finally sank in. Their eyes wide with absolute terror, my mother and father lost all color. They had spent years mocking my little cleaning business, entirely blind to the fact that I didn't scrub floors for minimum wage. I employed hundreds of people and commanded a multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my water as the absolute panic in the room reached a fever pitch. It was time to reveal my cunning long game. Years ago, when I first told my parents about my business idea, they scoffed, refused to lend me a single dime, and told me I would amount to nothing. So I took their rejection and used it as fuel. I intentionally kept my massive success entirely anonymous, operating under a dense web of corporate shields and holding companies so my family could never leech off my hard work. I let them believe their own comforting lie that I was just a failing maid, waiting for the perfect moment to let their own arrogance destroy them. And that moment had finally arrived. I looked directly at my sister's fiancé, who was staring at me with his mouth wide open. "You know, Chloe," I said smoothly, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "it's quite funny how things work out. Your fiancé's commercial logistics firm was just acquired by a subsidiary of Vance Elite Holdings last month. Technically speaking, I am his ultimate boss." The groom went entirely pale, but the trap was about to close even tighter. My private investigator had already discovered that my parents had heavily leveraged their own primary home with a massive second mortgage just to fund Chloe's lavish, over-the-top wedding. They did this under the desperate assumption that her rich new in-laws would inevitably bail them out of their financial ruin once the marriage was official. Victoria Sterling saw right through it. She stood up, looking at my parents with disgust, and explicitly stated that her family would never marry into a family of short-sighted, cruel liars who mistreat true power. The wedding atmosphere completely collapsed into absolute chaos. The groom broke down right there at the table, clutching his head as he realized his mother was entirely serious about cutting off his multi-million-dollar trust fund if he stayed aligned with Chloe's toxic family. Chloe began sobbing hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face as she watched her dream of marrying into high society disintegrate in a matter of seconds. Seeing their entire desperate financial plan unravel, my parents completely changed their tone. The cold sneers were gone, replaced by frantic, trembling smiles. My mother rushed over to my side, grabbing my hands and begging me to play along, to tell Victoria it was all just a big family joke. My father eagerly joined in, offering me the praise they had strictly denied me for over a decade. They were practically on their knees, pleading with this simple maid to save them from total ruin. But I felt absolutely nothing for them. I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out a manila folder containing an official legal notice I had brought with me. I set it firmly on the table and signed my name at the bottom, right in front of their terrified faces. This document officially terminated all corporate grace periods on my parents' commercial debts and completely canceled Victoria's pending real estate contracts. I stood up, smoothed down the plain black dress they had forced me to wear, and walked out of the venue, completely detached from their manufactured chaos. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of cruelty and superficial lies, and I was more than happy to let it all burn down. 3 months later, the dust is finally settled, and I am watching the waves roll in from the porch of my charming new cottage in Carmel, completely at peace. The fallout from that night was absolute. Chloe's high society wedding was called off the very next morning, and my parents were forced to downsize heavily into a tiny apartment due to their catastrophic financial mismanagement and the immediate calling of their debts. They lost their status, their country club friends, and their pride. Meanwhile, I expanded my corporate empire, building a life of true independence where my worth is never dictated by superficial titles. If there is one valuable lesson to take away from my journey, it is that arrogance and underestimating others will always lead to an absolute downfall. When you treat people based entirely on what they can do for you, rather than who they are, you pave your own path to ruin. My family tried to use their words to diminish me, completely blind to the fact that true power doesn't need to loud. It just needs to be patient. Now, I'm highly curious about you, who have listened to my story until the very end. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had your own family completely underestimate your worths and the city you're watching from? And meanwhile, I am leaving on the final screen 2 other shocking stories that